Greetings, I am Rijad, and welcome to my fire. I admit, I did not expect company this night. However, I think you're lucky because I was just about to tell a story to myself. A story of murder, revenge, and a butler, the Daedra, and war. Interested yet? Have a seat and enjoy some moon sugar, for the story takes place many moons ago in the Second Era. This is the story of a man who became a monster. This is the story of Death's Arrow. The story does not start atop some mountain as the gods' thunderous applause mark the arrival of a dragonborn, or as a baby floating downstream to an awaiting mother with a prophecy for great deeds promised to his name. This story starts in Cyrodiil, inside of one of Anvil's brothels. The moans and wails of women used and manipulated for gold ring out into the night sky. However, they are soon put to silence as the sound of a screaming child pierces the normality. In one of the rooms, a man lifts a small baby boy from between a black-haired woman's legs and into her view. She gazes in horror.
A son?
She looks up at the man.
What do I do?
The man speaks firmly. You'll raise the child, even if you do not know the father. Understand? The young woman nods and extends her arms up for the boy. The man looks down to the child and says, You'll need to name him, before handing him to the woman, who says rather quickly,
I want to name him Antigonus. I think it suits him. Little Antigonus.
As time went by, this young baby grew into a small boy who lived in a world of adultery. As his mother worked to maintain him through whatever means necessary, he set to work cleaning and maintaining the brothel as if it were his own home. Alas, it was indeed his home, for he spent his entire young life there. The young boy grew older each passing year, until by the time he was 16 years old, he had become the brothel's private houseman, not only maintaining the building itself, but cleaning its ladies after each client, and acting as a sort of enforcer should any of them come under harm, for he had grown into a rather well-built young lad. One eve, the young Antigonus was making his mother's bed after a client had recently visited. She lay in the bath, cleaning herself and tilting her head to look over at him.
Antigonus, you're 16 now, aren't you?
Antigonus nodded, his green eyes looking over to her. Last month, Mama. His mother smiled, her green eyes meeting his own.
Have you ever wanted to leave this place, Antig? You must have dreams, my poor boy.
Antigonus lowered his gaze, never really thinking of the world beyond this building, let alone the city of Anvil.
Antig,
His mother stumbles with her words.
I think it's time you leave.
Her tone was cold, and it struck Antigonus deep within his heart, making his face pale and his body grow cold.
This is no place for a young man, only old pigs without their wives.
She hissed venomously.
I am sending you to Duke Aquilarius of Bruma to serve in his legions. I hear he commands great respect for the province. Perhaps if you fight for him, you'll find some purpose in this life.
Antigonus lowered his eyes. There was a sadness in him that suddenly struck him, causing him to run over and wrap his arms around his mother's neck. She nearly broke into tears at this act, her own wet arm wrapping around his neck as she whispered,
You promised me something, Antig. You leave this place and find the man in you your father never could be. I don't want you living in this poverty like your mama. Understand?
Antigonus's head buried into her hair. Small whimpers came from him as his body shuddered and shivered, not wanting to let go. His mother closed her eyes, biting her lip to try and stop herself from crying. Yet in that moment she did something Antigonus would never forget, and he would both remember it with distaste and appreciation.
Go,
she said firmly, those green eyes of hers glaring at him.
Leave, and don't you dare come back. Pack your things and leave.
She shoved Antigonus back, sending him onto his rear. He looked upon her with shock. Mummy, he whispered.
Go,
his mother said almost instantly.
Speak to the vegetable salesman down the street. He visits Bruma often, understand? Now go!
Antigonus panicked and tried to speak, not knowing what to do besides run for the door, closing it behind him. That would be the last he would ever see his mother. The next few hours were a dark and confusing time for the young Antigonus. Within a few hours of running from his mother, he had packed a small backpack full of a few apples and a loaf of bread, along with a single cotton blanket before departing from the brothel and heading towards the local market to find the vegetable salesman he knew as Edward. It did not take long for the young man to find him, for Antigonus had visited often to purchase food for the kitchen staff. Being late in the evening, however, by the time Antigonus arrived, he found the man shutting down his stall for the night.
"Oh, Antigonus! A shame, lad. All my goods are packed up. Why are you so late?"
Antigonus cleared his throat and said weakly, I need to go to Bruma." Edward raised his brow in sudden curiosity.
"Bruma? Why in the 8 do you need to go there? Running from your mother?"
Antigonus looked up at Edward with his young green eyes, a pleading look to them. She wants me to join the Legion, sir. I'm forbidden to return to her." Edward shook his head slightly before adding,
"Your mother and I go way back. Let me speak to her and make sure this is what she wants. If so, I'll take you there tomorrow. I'm heading there to pick up some more in Northmead. Few days' ride. Sound like a deal for you? If you need a place to sleep, go to the Temple of Mara. Deal?"
Antigonus nodded slightly, tears rolling down his cheeks as he glanced down the road towards the brothel, already missing his mother.
"Run along then, Antig. It's getting late."
Antigonus dipped his head thankfully and rushed off, his sleeve coming up to wipe tears from his eyes. And then he ran towards the only place he could, the Temple of Mara. That night, Antigonus was welcomed by the priests to stay. One of them even prepared a bed for him to sleep in, yet despite the comfort he was provided, Antigonus could not sleep well, for he missed his home. When sleep did finally claim him, he would not wake until the early hours of the morning by a rather odd old priest draped in brown robes and missing one of his eyes. Upon seeing this, Antigonus let out a yelp and pulled the blankets up close to his neck. What are you?" The old priest let out an amused laugh and said,
"What am I? A human being, of course. What are you?"
Antigonus's young eyes stare up at the old man with a mixture of both fear and confusion, before uttering, My name's Antigonus." The young old man smiled cheekily. His aged teeth stunk even from this distance, and Antigonus couldn't help but duck his head beneath the blanket.
"Well, what, Antigonus? Consider me a friend. Well, sort of.
Will you consider me a friend?" Antigonus's lips parted to speak, but not a sound came from them. This man's presence seemed to almost put a weight on the room, a feeling that to this day Antigonus could not understand.
"No need to speak, Antigonus. I'm old enough to know exactly what's going through your mind. To answer your question, which you kept unspoken, I help those who stay within the walls of this temple. I help them fight the gods. However, usually the gods have nothing to offer, as most simply need to find themselves."
The old man smiled. I don't think you're here to find yourself, are you? Perhaps someday, he mused. All of a sudden, the booming voice of Edward came from the other room.
Antigonus, lad, where are ya?
Antigonus let out a squeak and rolled off to the side, still stuck in his blankets. Alas, this did not stop him as he caterpillared his way out into the temple's main hall and said, I'm here! I'm here! Edward looked over and said rather quickly,
Ah, there you are, lad. Thought you would have changed your mind by now.
Antigonus looked back towards where he had been sleeping. There was no sign of that priest, and it brought a sense of relief to Antigonus.
No use wasting time then. Get your things and meet me outside. Caravan's all ready to go. We'll be travelling with some other lads. Hope you don't mind,
Edward said in a rather amused tone. Antigonus simply nodded, stumbling out the door with his backpack and blanket, hardly ready to go, but eager to leave nonetheless. A row of 3 wagons were waiting, each one seemingly from a different vendor and heavy with goods, while 2 men rode in the rear armed with swords strapped to their belts and chainmail clinging to their bodies. Antigonus stepped up onto the front wagon, and with a grunt he said, How long is this trip? Edward followed close behind, lifting up next to Antigonus and saying,
Well, a few days, long enough that I would get comfortable if I were you.
2 men then stepped up to either side of the wagon. One was rather rounded and a red-guard with vibrant blue eyes, while the other was a Khajiit with dark fur and orange eyes. Edward let out a small chuckle and said,
Ah, almost forgot. Meet our companions for this trip. Both of them rather skilled merchants. This is El-Sadin of Sentinel, and that is Rajad of Sensual.
The Khajiit smiled toothily and said, Ah, a pleasure, little Antigonus. His head lowered, ears lowering with it. The Redguard then added, Indeed, boy, a pleasure, a true pleasure. Edward gave a small, playful wave of his hand towards the 2 men and said,
Hey, lads, back into your wagons. Let's go before the beggars come clawing at our wheels.
Edward let out a sharp whistle, and soon the caravan was making its way down the road, the long road out of Anvil. Once the caravan had made it its way quite out of town, Edward suddenly chimed in,
Take a good look, Antigonus. That'll be the last time you see that city for a while, no doubt.
Antigonus glanced behind him at the slowly fading walls of Anvil. Little did he know that his childhood was forever left behind in those walls. The journey of this young man had started.